Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who will share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Hello, and welcome to another episode of American Medieval. I am Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I am excited to be joined by Eugene Smelyansky, who is an assistant professor at Washington State University. His research focuses on persecuted minority groups and also persecution in the late medieval world, and also medievalisms, not just in the United States, but in Russia as well. And so I'm looking forward to having that conversation. But before we get into that heavy stuff, and, that's not super fun stuff that we're going to be talking about. Sometimes with the Middle Ages, it rarely is. I do have a silly question. But first of all, welcome, Eugene.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited about this conversation. I've been eagerly awaiting this for a while now, and I'm glad we're finally here.
Same.
But as you know, and as our listeners know, so one of the things we like to do at American Medieval is the way that we start is, I'll beg your indulgence, we have kind of a silly question because it involves time machines, which, as you know, like if you were a historian, you have to kind of deal with time machines in some way or another. Somebody's going to ask you about time machines, about going back into the past. But our question, of course, is a little bit different, and it has to do with personal time machines. So let's imagine for a moment we have a time machine. That time machine has a one-use only limit, and it's been given to you, Eugene, with the caveat that you have to travel back into the past and talk to a younger version of yourself, a childhood version of yourself, and tell them that someday you're going to grow up to be a medievalist. How does childhood Eugene react to that news?
I think a kind of mixture of emotions, really.
Okay.
Excitement, for sure, and also a kind of trepidation. And excitement coming from the fact that, so it's a little bit of a story. So I grew up in Odessa in Ukraine, in a kind of a Russian-Ukrainian Jewish family. And my mother is from St. Petersburg in Russia. And so we would visit family as one does, a couple times a year and stuff like that. And one of those visits, I think I was about 7 years old, we went to the Hermitage Museum, right? Which for listeners who don't know, it's very similar to that kind of classic European museum, former palace with, a little bit of everything, right? You have some Egyptian stuff, some Greek and Roman stuff, some, Renaissance art, 19th century art. And of course, there is a room filled with medieval arms and armor. And I remember as a 7-year-old entering that room and something snapped or something broke or something in my head, stirred. And I was there, easily an hour, if not longer. And which is really funny because, of course, professionally, I don't do anything having to do with knights or armor or military history, right? But at that moment, that was what really sort of awoke in me. And of course, also, that was the time when I was, starting to read Tolkien and Ursula Le Guin and kind of all the kind of traditional sort of nerdy stuff, science fiction, fantasy, really more fantasies than science fiction. So that's the kind of excitement part. Mm-hmm. The trepidation part, though, which maybe was not at age 7 necessarily that I realized that, but it was a time, I kind of lived growing up around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. And, history was everywhere. Like people were really keenly interested in history. Like Soviet archives were starting to be opened up, right? You could finally actually talk about the past without fearing, repercussions from the state and whatnot. But at the same time, like because those fledgling kind of post-Soviet states were really struggling and universities were all state enterprises, faculty was really not being paid or being paid very little and was struggling as well. And so really until I moved to the United States and started college, like I loved history, but like the idea you could be a professional historian, that you could actually be someone who does it for kind of a living, just never crossed my mind, right? Like I wanted to be a scientist at different points or a writer or all kinds of different things, but it's really not until, I took that first college history class, I think it was like a survey of American history, and like actually saw someone who is like a historian, right? Even though that person was, the person was an adjunct who was like, trying to cobble together jobs at many different universities. as one does. But the idea that, okay, this is a historian they can actually like look at and want to be as one. And that really, really, again, kind of changed my whole trajectory. And I switched to history and never looked back. But it's sort of that idea of like, sure, history is great and I would love to learn all about it, but that's not really a job. Like a job is something completely different. Looking at the job market, maybe there is something to it, but there's certainly like echoes of that. But I think is really interesting that like public interest in history and public's willingness to support professional historians, right, sometimes are not at the same pace or at the same level.
Just to kind of emphasize that, I think that it's oftentimes bizarre when you think about the public interest, the hunger at times for knowing about the past, with the unwillingness to support the teaching of or the study of that very same past. And I think, we're seeing some of that kind of in contemporary American society, of course. But in these moments of profound transition, not just kind of 2026 United States, but as you were saying, during the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, like people are aware of what history means, right? And why history is important. And that goes for the medieval past as well, right?
Absolutely. And a lot of that history, right? Because it was sort of, the Soviet outlook on the history, right? That kind of like a Marxist-Leninist kind of historical materialism, I guess we could call it, approach was, again, kind of on decline. So there was a lot of interest in alternative perspectives, right? Which it often meant that like 19th century works of history were being kind of reprinted and republished, which of course brought its own problems because those were predictably very outdated and very kind of positivist perspectives. So that created its own problem again, like, in terms of, yes, it's an alternative view, but it's not necessarily an accurate one. But yeah, people were obsessed with it. There was a kind of like a nationalist wave of, like what is, right? Like all those kind of post-Soviet states, right? Like whether it's Russia or Ukraine or Belarus or many others, they were trying to kind of reassert their nationhood by looking at the past, by looking, reaching all the way to the Middle Ages in a variety of ways. And some of that, again, is still very much ongoing, of course.
Yeah, and that's interesting too. Like I have my own pet theory about some of the resurgence in interest in the Middle Ages in the 21st century. And a lot of it has to do with what is freely available on the internet. Like what's out of copyright, and that's 19th and early 20th century history. And as in most disciplines, but in medieval studies as well, right? There's kind of waves of interest in certain things, and when certain things go out of copyright and then become kind of much more publicly available, on Amazon, there's like those not bootleg, but just like a million copies of books about the Dark Ages or the Crusades or something like that, right? Like it seems like that seems to track a few years later. There's kind of a surge in interest in those types of things because it's difficult to get academic research, if you're just kind of an average Joe living in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of that's not the only reason, but like one of the reasons of like the enduring like popularity of Gibbon, right, for like Roman history is because, well, you can type Gibbon into Google and get his books and read them, right? And he writes. He writes in a very outdated way, but if that's how you think historians should write.
But that's it, right? Like he writes like you think an academic should write, right? Like in this kind of high register, you can hear it in kind of the very educated kind of English voice. And I don't know why I tried to do that accent right there, but
like that guy knows that, like sounds like he knows stuff, right?
Exactly. And that's why I think that, I don't know, like just off the top of my head, like maybe things like podcasts are good ways to, get information out there, to talk to scholars about things and to make sure that people know that this is an exciting period of history. It has its horrors as well as its wonders, but they're understandable. I'm curious too, though, just to go backtrack, because I want to say two things about, you said your story about the time machine is that, one, it's super interesting because when I ask that question, of course, I get lots of different types of answers, but almost everybody is thinking of the same age or right around the same age. It's like 7 to 10, like right there. Like, I'm just saying like childhood version, right? Like, so that could be kind of anybody. I don't know what to make of that. Maybe somebody, in the comments can tell me something about that. But the other thing I wanted to just kind of ask about is that you mentioned being interested in the Middle Ages kind of generally, but not knowing about this as a profession until you got to college. But you mentioned you took an American history course. So what moved you into the Middle Ages back into college? Was there a certain course, or did you remember that kind of childhood experience, like visions of knights kind of dancing in your heads?
That's a really good question, because once I decided that I wanted to be a historian, I think it made like total sense to me that I should be a medievalist.
Okay.
Because again, that like of that kind of passion for it
Yeah.
since childhood. I had a little like dalliance. I was a classics minor, and there was a moment where I don't know why, like it was kind of, like I had a lot of friends who were classicists, and so like, oh, maybe I should do Rome or something like that. But then like I feel like my Latin was never good enough to do, you know what I mean? That like we're we need, I mean, as medievalists, we need Latin, of course, too. But like they really need Latin, and they need Greek, and I think that kind of scared me away a little bit. But no, I mean, I always wanted the Middle Ages. But I think what's also really interesting, and I think that can also speak to one of the reasons why the Middle Ages are so popular with the public, is that, when I was growing up, I also had a feeling that like more recent history gets kind of twisted out of shape and politicized and is kind of can't really be sort of trusted. But, the Middle Ages are, I mean, it's just stuff that happened, right? Like it's there's no interpretation involved. It's history at its quote unquote purest. But obviously, as I was studying it, that feeling disappeared, thank God. But you know what I mean? I think there is this idea that like, oh, like, the Middle Ages are not politicized, right? Or even if they are, it doesn't really matter, right? Like the medieval history is more about like vibes and kind of like, like even if you don't get all the facts right, like it doesn't matter as much as like popular kind of history buffs who study, I don't know, World War II or something like that get very like obsessed with like minutia, right? Like of this or that like weapon or this or that battle or something like that. Whereas I think most people who study or who like the Middle Ages on a kind of popular level often are kind of like, well, this is kind of what happened, right? We don't really know. I mean, we see this with popular interest in like something like the Crusades, right? Like Crusades didn't end well, but that no one really focuses on that part. Everyone focuses on the kind of early successes. So it's sort of this kind of vibes thing. But so for me, it was kind of like, oh, like, I want to study history maybe that wasn't as kind of tainted by modern interpretation. And then of course, as I became a medievalist, it was like, oh, I see. It's not, that's not a real thing.
I'm struck by what you were saying, though. Like, it's really kind of fired something, because I think you're absolutely onto something there. There's something about the study of modern history among the kind of general population, I should say, like not necessarily among scholars, about getting things kind of correct and proper. But then with the Middle Ages, it's when people are kind of interested in the Vikings or the Crusades, or even kind of sometimes kind of like women's history or, religious history. It is more like, it's almost like a moral history, isn't it? Is that they're looking for kind of larger lessons in which they're concerned about accuracy, of course, or they're interested in accuracy, but there's still that kind of veil of the Dark Ages, if you will, like of not being able to kind of know all the details and just being okay with that in order to pull these kind of larger lessons, like you were saying about the Crusades, for example, which is something that you and I, kind of both know a lot about, is that we know kind of the details of the Crusades. We know that they were ultimately, except for kind of the first and then maybe the fourth, if you're being very generous, like ultimately failures. But they tell a story for the people who are interested in them about valiance and manhood and duty and honor and religiosity that kind of transcend any of those details. And where do you think that comes from? And the thing that's immediately kicking in my mind is like, that's 19th century philosophy of history.
Right.
So is that another reason, like, we got to be wary of this out of copyright stuff and how it circulates?
I think very much so. And I think there is a kind of a romanticization of it, right? It's also, I think, comes from, again, that kind of 19th century tendency to just like do like all of the Middle Ages all at once, right? Which kind of, again, very much in that kind of Dark Ages style where, everything gets kind of compressed, right? And so you have, again, especially if you're not an expert, right? Like you have Charlemagne and, Richard the First and I don't know, the Great Schism, right? All like kind of coexisting at around the same time.
Sure.
And I think a lot of it also comes from like almost like myths and fairy tales and this very like romantic interpretation, right? Where you have most people are imagining the Middle Ages and they might know that like King Arthur is not really real, but it's easy for them to imagine him as if like he was, right? Or same with like Robin Hood or something like that, right? Where like they're kind of inhabiting, they're like characters inhabiting the story. And I think, that's one of the reasons why medieval Europe is such a fruitful and kind of like popular setting for like fantasy in general, right? Is that
Sure.
it's easy to build a world because people kind of know what's going on, or they think they do, and then you just insert characters and you just, add dragons or add, elves or whatever,
Yeah.
and there you go. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, no, I think that's a huge, and again, with fairy tales, right, comes
Sure.
morality, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Hmm.
Like that kind of moral clarity where you can easily tell who's good, who's bad. Things are not as complicated as I think they get, at least in people's minds.
Yeah.
When we get to like, I don't know, the 20th century or something like that.
Yeah, I love the word paint that you used because like it immediately conjured like I don't know if you've seen in like thrift shops or like in art stores or something like that, or like at farmers market stalls. Is that sometimes people take like an older painting and then they'll paint something kind of on it, right? It's like having a picture of like a medieval scene and then like somebody just draws a dragon up there. It's like, look, high fantasy, right? So, we are being entirely unfair and like, oh man, we might get roasted for this. But and I love high fantasy and I read high fantasy. But there are absolutely kind of that genre of writing in which you just kind of pull a stock image, as you were saying, of kind of the Middle Ages and then just paint some magical creatures kind of onto it or some sort of magic system onto it. And then all of a sudden you have a different moral story, right? Like a different kind of vibes-based kind of thing in which the medieval does a certain amount of work towards that end, right? Which you don't have to do. You could just put a guy in armor on a horse and like everybody's going to kind of get that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a ready-made set of images. And I think trying to remember, I think Andrew Elliott, right, talks about how kind of essence of medievalism is that people are not really referring back to the actual medieval period, but rather to kind of other symbols, right? So it becomes kind of like a copy of a copy of a copy over time.
Yeah, Andrew Elliott's book is really fantastic about that. Is what he calls banal medievalism. It just becomes like a recursive symbol, right? In which, in theory, there's a Middle Ages kind of behind there, but it's just like fantasy references other fantasy, and you never actually get to the Middle Ages itself. It's just kind of like this symbol that kind of just repeats itself all over the place. So
exactly.
But the Middle Ages themselves, this is what's called a transition. The Middle Ages themselves are an interesting period too. One of the things that I think is really fascinating, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about, is the way that your work, especially, and people that you work adjacent to as well, is it kind of upends a lot of assumptions about the period in the same kind of way, right? Is that like one of the things, for example, that people often think that like David and I confronted when we were writing The Bright Ages, that we deal with every time any of us kind of teach our classes, is that Europe is white and male and Christian, and that's it. And that's simply not true. Correct?
Yes, of course. Yeah, it is really interesting, right? And I think that was something that kind of always bothered me, right? Just one, how narrowly defined Europe, like medieval Europe was.
Yes.
Like even when I was in undergraduate, most of it was focusing on, Britain and France or England and France, right? And maybe a little bit of Germany, maybe a little bit of like Italy-ish, Spain already gets kind of tentative. And I think, thankfully, that's been kind of expanding. And now I think surveys include much broader kind of spectrum of things. But yeah, I mean, I think that was also something that I felt very passionate about, is that having taught a class on marginalized communities in the Middle Ages, I realized that just how little my students knew about that, and how always they were so surprised. Like, oh my God, there were, I don't know, queer people in the Middle Ages, or oh my God, there were people of color or non-Christians or polytheistic communities in the Middle Ages or something like that. And so one of the reasons I put together the reader, Intolerant Middle Ages, a reader with the University of Toronto Press, was to provide that kind of, here are the primary sources. Like, you can actually read about all these individuals and all these communities and their stories. And also kind of show that I think it's not only important to show that these people were there, but also to show that, like, again, like, I don't want to create a kind of Pollyanna-ish vision of the Middle Ages where like everyone was like frolicking and everything was great. Obviously, like, intolerance was a thing, but a lot of the times within that intolerance, you see tolerance as well, where like everything is fine and the person is living their life, and then someone shows up and like messes it up for them. Usually someone in power. Whereas like the communities are often much more tolerant on a kind of everyday level until they're stirred into some kind of persecutory frenzy. So I think that is something that I think is very important to also teach, is that this is not some kind of like, oh, people are hiding in the cellars and not daring to show their face, but often they're very central. They're marginalized in the kind of a legal and social sense, but they're also very much in the center of things. And I think that's something that really kind of drove me when I was putting that reader
Yeah.
together. And in general, just also like when I was writing my first monograph and that came out of my dissertation to show that cities in Central Europe had often very well kind of represented heretical communities that were okay for a while until it became convenient and kind of profitable politically and sometimes economically to get rid of them, in which case they were then gotten rid of. But I think that idea that if we want to expand the kind of the lachrymose theory, right, to just kind of all marginalized figures, right, or marginalized groups, like it wasn't some kind of like, again, that kind of dark ages where everything is terrible until we get to some kind of, beacon of modernity, but rather that it was, again, kind of a mixed situation, just like it is today, just like it is 500 years ago and so on.
Yeah. As your scholarship kind of demonstrates as well, is that this is not a new thing, is to point out that these marginalized communities have existed in Europe for a long time and that the picture of them is complicated, right? Anybody who's trying to tell you kind of a very simple story about things just kind of getting worse or a Pollyanna-ish, like you said, kind of version of like, oh, things were great and then, something happened and it turned bad. That ain't it, right? Like it's always the historian's job to basically say like, nah, it's more complicated than that. Like whatever you think, no, it's more complicated than that because we're dealing with people and people are complicated creatures. Absolutely.
If you guys ever get merch for the podcast, you should have like it's more complicated than that, like on like a t-shirt or something like that.
Maybe we can get like bobbleheads of me like just
it's and then it's like it's more complicated
it's more complicated than that. So So, and I realized too, I will learn this eventually about a podcast that it's an audio only meaning. So me actually bobbling my head like I just did, I need to actually narrate that so people know that I'm actually doing that. So anyway, season 4 or 5, we'll get all the kinks kind of smoothed out, whatever, we'll get there. So the reader that you mentioned, The Intolerant Middle Ages, as you said, like out with University of Toronto Press, it has the actual primary sources in translation. So that's, they're available, like people can read them. And it's so interesting the way that you can, especially in a classroom, you're able to work with students to show them kind of the nuances of how some of these stories are put together, or some of these histories, I should say, are put together in order to reveal sometimes things that, on the surface might not be readily available. And I'll give you an example kind of what I'm thinking, because I teach a course on the Crusades all the time at Virginia Tech, because that's people want to take it and that's what I'm interested in. People think it's going to be, and I probably shouldn't say this because my students might actually hear this at some point and then they won't take the course, is that they think it's going to be kind of like military and political history, but then it's basically like a history of historiography and biblical commentaries and all sorts of like really other weird kind of cultural and which I think is much more interesting. But one of the things we always talk about is the massacre of the Jews that happens in the Rhineland in 1096 during the First Crusade, because there's a collection of translated Hebrew sources as well. So you're not just reading kind of the Christian versions of this, you can read from the Hebrew perspective. And there's all sorts of problems with those sources and stuff like that. But one of the things that I love to talk about is that in the midst, as the violence is going on, is that there's all these moments in which it's clear that members of the community, like in Mainz and Speyer and Worms, are actually trying to protect the Jews of their community against their fellow Christians, right? And that there's all this violence going on, but at the same time, it's much more complicated than just a Christians versus Jews thing, which the Christian sources are really trying to kind of push. It's things like that you can kind of really pull in. It's like, okay, if they're saying this, what does that tell us about their everyday experience, like for the years that existed before the Crusaders shows up? Like, was it always confrontational? Like, I don't think so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is something that I encounter whenever I teach, another wave of anti-Jewish violence during the plague, right? And especially, so cities in the Rhineland are kind of sending each other these letters, basically asking kind of like, have you guys heard that, plague supposedly is caused by well poisoning, right? That was kind of at the sort of conspiracy theory of the time. And, some cities are like, yeah, totally. Like, we should totally get on board with that and, expel our Jewish communities or worse, right? Or attack them. But there are also cities that are like, what are the sources for this? Like, we're fine. You know what I mean? Like, they're asking kind of like, what is this based on? Like, why are you spreading this information? What is your evidence? And so I think it's important to remember that like people in the Middle Ages are no like dumber or smarter, right, than people sort of today, right? I mean, they also have critical thinking. Like, they're not critical thinking wasn't invented yesterday. And I always like to joke to my students that like more people in the world today think the world is flat than people did in the Middle Ages. But I mean, that's, I've never counted, right? Maybe that's not true. But the point is that, like, if persecution wasn't convenient, if it wasn't useful, right, then it wasn't really a thing. Like, it wasn't just some kind of, random kind of knee-jerk reaction to people they didn't like. Like, both persecution and toleration were conscious decisions. I mean, with some exceptions, of course, but often were conscious decisions made by people who stood to gain something from it, right? In some cases, tolerating was useful for various reasons. In some cases, persecution was perceived as convenient. I think that's kind of the really animating sort of idea. And, as I was thinking about it, and of course, whenever I teach this class, I often assign David Nirenberg's Communities of Violence.
Yes.
And I think, like, he does such a great job at, like, complicating this often kind of flat narrative of persecution. In fact, so, like, when the reader was still in the process, the original title was supposed to be The Intolerant Middle Ages ? A reader.
Mm-hmm.
And then, because apparently, like, question marks don't work well with the databases.
Yeah.
So we decided
it had to be a statement rather than a question.
But then it was funny because some of the, like, especially early reviews of the book were like, he's saying that Europe was intolerant in the Middle Ages. And it's like, no, I literally don't. It's just the title.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely, trying to show, again, the kind of diversity, right? And really kind of decenter the Dark Ages, I think, is something that I've been trying to do as long as I've been doing it.
It's something that we always kind of struggle with. And, I was recording another episode just a little while ago, and we were talking about kind of what brings people to the study of the Middle Ages, just in like a college classroom, because in a K-12 situation, a K-12 environment, in Virginia, at least, which a lot of the students who come to Virginia Tech, they come through the public school system, is that there's very little anything about the Middle Ages. Like, it's covered kind of incrementally in English classes sometimes with kind of the greats of English literature, Beowulf, and a little bit of Chaucer maybe, or something like that. And then as like a hit very briefly in world history, the focus on world history is always after like 1450, because that's where the AP, after they changed their rules and stuff like that. Maybe a little bit kind of before that. Anyway, but the thing that brings them in the classroom are oftentimes pop culture references, right? And a lot of the pop culture around kind of the Middle Ages comes from things like, TV shows and video games and fantasy books and stuff like that. And so, again, it's really always kind of butting up against those assumptions, those long-term kind of zombie myths and assumptions that, again, anything that we can do to say it's kind of complicated, that these people were actually human beings who, as you said, kind of could deploy critical thinking skills, that's, I think, has a lot of value. And, the Nuremberg thing, I think it's such a great book, and it's so useful because he does do such a great job of showing, like, that there is kind of what he calls, I believe, kind of everyday violence, right? Like, violence that isn't always captured by the sources of a persecuted community, a minority community that has to endure the indignities of living as a minority community in a majority thing. Absolutely 100%. But then as well, like, revealing these moments in which there are people just kind of getting on with their lives. There's a great chapter in there, I remember, about concerns about sexual purity in Iberia, right? In which Christian churchmen get really concerned about Christian men, especially sleeping with, and Christian women kind of sleeping with Muslims and Jews. And it's really clear it's because they're just doing it. Like, people are just having sex, like, with everybody, kind of basically, in Iberia, and they're not really concerned about these religious boundaries. And the churchmen are the ones who decide, like, no, we gotta kind of cut this off. But that's a response to a specific historical context. And that's why, like, the stuff that we do, I think, in the classroom and in our research is so important to show, like, we can understand why these moments happen here and not over there.
You're absolutely right. I think students come in with certain, like, preconceived notions of, like, this is what they're going to encounter. I was teaching just this past semester, I was teaching kind of, like, what used to be called, Western Civ, right, is now just kind of ancient, medieval, early modern Europe, first half of that. And, it was really interesting, like, showing, like, including even discussions about, the Islamic world in the aftermath of, the fall of Rome, right? And kind of like how the Islamic world was kind of like one of those, like, cultural sort of heirs of the fall of the kind of Roman Empire. I had students write reflections at the end of the semester and show what they've learned, what they found most interesting. And so many of them were like, I didn't realize that, medieval Europe was so connected to everything else.
Yeah.
That people moved, that there was trade, that, this wasn't like everyone was sitting in their village and, mired in mud and in a kind of like Monty Python sort of esque way.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that is so important, because hopefully so many of the students will have a little bit of a kind of like a vaccine jab against the dark ages. And also something that I actually did for the first time is that every week I was providing like popular materials, right? So, podcasts and interviews. I think there was one of the interviews you and David Perry did for the Bright Ages as one of those, right? And it just to kind of show, this is what you guys are reading in the textbook, this is what you guys are reading with primary sources, but this is also what the actual historians who study this kind of say about this period in this or that way, right? And I think that really helped to, again, kind of, I think often like history has that problem of the means of production being hidden, so to speak, right? Where like kind of history just kind of like bubbles up from the depths of the earth, so to speak. And I think it's very important for students to know like who are the historians, like who is making the arguments, who's doing the work. And then hopefully maybe they'll listen to those podcasts more, or they will look up works by those historians and kind of, encounter it on a deeper level even.
Yes, it would save all of us so much time if history would just spring Athena-like from our head without any sort of work.
Just plug in the USB cord.
Exactly.
I'm not sure where, but
man, it doesn't work like that. Oh, man. Simple and Clean is a show where hosts Misha Stanton and Mayana Baron and friends talk about Kingdom Hearts, a little video game franchise about really big feelings. Join them as they discuss plot, characters, world building, music, fashion, fan base, and more. Never heard of Kingdom Hearts? That's okay. They're here to break it down for you, explain why they love it, and hopefully to convince you that this weird little story deserves a place in your heart. New episodes every Sunday wherever you find your podcasts. Go listen now. As a way of kind of transitioning to your more recent work, your new book that's, is it out yet, or is it?
It is, yeah, no, it's out. It's been out for a couple years. It's about to come out in paperback though, so which
that's what I've seen. Okay.
Thank God, because as we know, books are expensive.
They are expensive, yes,
and especially like sort of small presses, academic books. But I think the paperback will be much more affordable, and I hope more people will be able to read it, because I think it's a very interesting book, and I sort of wrote it with the more of a kind of public reader in my mind, so hopefully more people will be able to read it.
You present the material in such an engaging, I don't want to say entertaining, but it is entertaining like way. Like I think it's okay for scholars to be entertaining. I should say that out front. I need to actually own that, because I really do believe it. Like we should be entertaining. Like people should actually enjoy reading our stuff. It doesn't have to be like torture in order to read an academic's work. That's a bad thing when that happens.
Not like Gibbon in that way.
It's not like Gibbon, but at least Gibbon had the very fancy voice that you can hear in your head as
he was entertaining in a different way. I suppose.
He was entertaining in a different way, but because it's about not medieval studies, but about medievalism, and the squishy difference between them is that maybe you could kind of talk just for a moment too about kind of what do you mean when you say medievalisms, because I don't know that that's necessarily, it's something we kind of talk about on the show, but maybe need to define, at least specifically in this case, like why was that the focus that you wanted to do for this book?
Yeah, so at the kind of a most like basic sort of definition, medievalisms are the ways that we've been interacting as people. We've been interacting with the Middle Ages, imagining them, reimagining them, representing them, misrepresenting them in the century since, right? In centuries since the Middle Ages. And, in my book, I focus on specifically Russia, and I focus on a pretty kind of broad timeline, right? You could call it kind of longue durée, right? But basically, for the most part, kind of 1700s through now. And again, I mean, for me, it was important to focus on this long timeline, I mean, for a very short book too, because, again, like to reference, Andrew Elliott again, there is a lot of this kind of recursiveness, right? Where in order to understand why certain individuals or certain events are invoked now, you can't just go back to like early 20th century, because in the early 20th century, they were referring to these things also not directly, but through something else, right? So you kind of have to almost like see this kind of chain of transmission, or the way that I talk about it in the book is kind of like accretion of layers, right? Kind of like a layer cake, or like, I don't know, a snowball that keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so you kind of have to know what those layers are in order to understand how they've been used. And each time, a new layer appears, right, it's slightly different.
Sure.
Right? So it kind of adds something new, and then you end up with these very complex kind of myths about, especially like individuals, that have often very, very little to do with what the individuals were in the first place.
Yeah. We were talking earlier, about Andrew Elliott and his understanding of certain types of pop culture medievalisms, again, kind of like you're talking about, in which there's no Middle Ages there. Did you find that very often in the stuff that you were studying? Like, was there a concern about the actual Middle Ages, or was there something kind of in which it was just like you were talking about layers, and that's what got me thinking about this? Like, was it just a sense that you were just kind of, you were peeling back layers, and you could just kind of infinitely peel back layers and never get to the Middle Ages when you were dealing with kind of Russian conceptions about certain figures or events or something like that?
Well, I mean, there's always something, like there's always some kind of like kernel of factual information there, deeply buried, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that whatever that initial kind of grain was gets covered pretty quickly. But I think what's also very important is that, like, a lot of the times these myths still have the power of claiming that they are authentic and they are in fact kind of factual and accurate, right? And I think that's where that power comes from. Earlier, we were talking about how, people often think of the Middle Ages as kind of like a more vibes kind of based, in a more vibes based way. But at the same time, I mean, I think it's like vibes, but it's also certain authenticity there, right?
Of course.
At least emotionally. And so I think a lot of myths related to Russian, or how Russia kind of claimed essentially medieval Rus as its Middle Ages, are related to, again, that idea of like authenticity or origins or justifications, right? Like, we are this way because of something that happened, in the like 800s, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that is something that is very important to untangle, right? Because again, like, things get more and more complicated. I mean, especially in Russian history, there is this tendency to always claim continuities, right?
Yeah.
So like Putin's regime claims continuities with both the Soviet Union and Imperial Russia. And of course, Imperial Russia was trying to like lay claim to the earlier period and so on and so forth, right? So there is an intentionality in referring to these earlier examples and picking up these earlier traditions and claiming them to create this like illusion of like stability and continuity and, 1,000-year-old civilization, as, Putin and his advisors often refer to Russia, that it has this like 1,000 years of history.
Yeah. There's kind of two things I want to kind of pick up on or ask you about. I think they're sort of related, but maybe just one at a time, is that one of the things that, as scholars who are familiar with kind of the historiography of the Middle Ages, or the development of the study of the Middle Ages, which, I think is effectively medievalism, but don't tell my colleagues I say that, because sometimes they don't like that when I say that. Whoops. Anyway, is that Russia is always kind of, from the Western perspective, it's always kind of seen as kind of outside, right? As kind of different. Like, it's sort of like Iberia in that it's like, yeah, you're kind of Europe, but not really. But like Russia's even like more so, because it's like, it's kind of over there. In your study, in your research related to kind of how Russians themselves were kind of thinking about the Middle Ages, was that reflected in the Russian scholarship, either as kind of a rejection of that, or did you see it kind of an apologia or apologies about kind of just trying to really say like, no, we're very, very much European? And I'm sure this depends on kind of the time and the place and stuff like that, but maybe you could just talk about that for a second.
Yeah, it's a great question. It is something that I kind of had to contend with, because you're absolutely right that both from the outside, right? Like, again, like we talked about earlier, how, like when, even when I was a undergraduate student, most medieval history classes focused on like mainly Western Europe, right?
Yeah.
With some inclusion, but mainly Western Europe. So within that paradigm, right, like Russia was always kind of the other one. And I think the Cold War has something to do with that too, right? And kind of it, I think, impacted Eastern Europe in general, where like Eastern Europe is often thought of as like not super central to the Middle Ages. But I think within Russia as well, right? Like there is always this tendency to see it as distinct, right? There's a kind of like a, what, Germans would call, Sonderweg, right? This kind of cultural distinctiveness,
Sure.
And even like in terms of terminology being used. So what I call very explicitly medieval Rus in Russian is called ancient Rus.
Oh, okay.
Which is kind of, confusing. And then they would refer to 12th century as ancient Rus. But the point here is that, of course, it is part of European historical narrative, right? Because, there's trade, there's dynastic marriages, there's travel, there is, all kinds of connections, right? It's really hard to say why is Poland, medieval, and then, you move slightly to the east and suddenly it's this whole different thing. But also I one of the reasons I wanted to be very clear that I call it medieval is because I think these claims of this kind of civilizational distinctiveness are often used politically,
of course, yes,
to make arguments that Russia doesn't care about human rights because that was never part of our cultural civilizational code or whatever. And that's not true, right? That's just frankly not true, and it's not borne out by Russian history at all either. And so I think dispelling that idea that it's Russia is its own separate beast is very important. And those claims are often made in a variety of settings. I mean, from the outside too, I think, especially I've seen some Western commentators talking about, for instance, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war, kind of pointing out that well, what can you expect? I mean, Russia is Russia, right? And it's well, no, you can't, it's, again, right? There's no fixed mindsets, national mindsets or anything like that. It's all about people making choices, right? And I think whenever we try to reduce, as a lot of those civilizational approaches, they kind of basically in the 90s Russian conservatives took the Clash of Civilizations, right? Samuel Huntington's work, Huntington so much to answer for.
We all hate Samuel Huntington. This podcast hates Samuel Huntington. So yes, go ahead.
But he basically, they take this idea. They're no, we are a separate civilization, right? And so you don't come at us with your discussion about democracy or human rights or anything like that. And obviously, again, that's just a convenient excuse to not engage with that.
Yeah. And it's really interesting and I think really important, because that was the other kind of thing I wanted to ask you is about kind of Russian medievalisms today. One of the things that at the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, is that there was a contest about kind of the ancient claims to the Ukraine. Was it part of kind of the greater Russia or was it something separate? And the Middle Ages kind of played a large part in that, both in the kind of Russian propaganda and then the Ukrainian response as well. So in Putin's Russia, kind of generally, how big a role does it seem that the Middle Ages play in kind of Putin's vision or the kind of greater Russian understanding of itself and its place kind of in the world stage, specifically to do with Ukraine, but kind of just maybe more generally?
Yeah. Well, it's both, right? Because, I think Ukraine plays and ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, right? The quote unquote loss, right? Which of course is a very contested term to use here, but that kind of quote unquote loss of Ukraine for Russia from the Russian perspective, again, especially from the perspective of the regime, is something they could never kind of recover from emotionally, right? They kind of had to do something about it in a way in their minds. And so in the 90s, Russia was trying to kind of almost reinvent themselves again, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union, right? So sort of what is Russia, right? And how do we make sense of these historical changes? And the way that they came up with it, which has something to do with kind of these meta historical theories that are there's some in the 19th century, there's some in the 20th century, but basically this idea that history is kind of cyclical, right? That, Russia goes through these phases where it loses territory, then it gains it back, right? And there's a kind of pendulum swinging back and forth. So essentially that, if Russia was, so to speak, losing territories in the 90s, it had to win them back in the next round, right? Yeah. And so the next round was kind of with Putin and so, good rulers of Russia, regain territories and bad ones lose them.
Yeah.
And of course, no one wants to be the bad one. So there was this idea of essentially tracing this pattern back to the Middle Ages, right?
Oh, really? Okay. All the way back.
To someone like Prince Vladimir or someone like that. And, and saying, look, those are the people who we want to be like. And of course, he was the Prince of Kiev. And therefore, Kiev is very, very important. And you can see that, right? They start in the early, in the 2016, I think, they put a massive statue to Vladimir in the middle of Moscow.
Oh, okay.
Which has right outside of Kremlin, right? So it's has this very what is it, right? Why is it there?
Yeah.
Moscow wasn't around even at that time. But it kind of has this notion of like, look, like this is the ruler we want to be most like. Of course, Vladimir and Vladimir Putin have, their namesakes. And so he certainly is kind of a popular character, even though, again, like no one cared about him in the 90s. No one cared about him in Russia. Like in the early 2000s, they actually did this thing, and I think a number of countries did. I think maybe it started in Britain. It was like kind of like almost like a reality show, but basically the nation like votes on their most important historical characters.
Okay.
I think maybe it was like a British sort of franchise that got sold to different countries, and they did one in Russia, and like Vladimir wasn't even within like the top 50 people or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So like no one, and that was in the early, I think it was 2008 or something like that. So it's like at that point, no one cared. But as the kind of relationship between Russia and Ukraine started to worsen, precisely because Ukraine didn't want to be within the Russian sphere of influence and wanted to basically be a sovereign country, as it should, you started to see this kind of, gearing up for the war, right? Where you start to see more and more people talking about, this idea that like Ukrainian, sovereignty is not born out of any history, that it's really Russia and Ukrainians who think they're not Russian. They're just kind of deluded by like Western propaganda, and essentially kind of undermining Ukrainian nationalism and statehood. And so you basically end up with essentially a kind of, propaganda campaign that lasted for like over a decade, really, eventually erupting into a war. And even, like about half a year before the full-scale invasion in 2022, so in the summer of 2021, there was that essay by Putin that basically said that, Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, they're all part of Rus. We're all ancestors. We're all kin. But of course, whenever they talk about, this kind of idea of kinship, right, it's always like, well, Russia is the oldest brother, right? Russia is the main, the one who's in charge, right? It's kind of like the siblings in like, Righteous Gemstones or something like that, where it's like, there's clear who's in charge.
Yeah. Vladimir Putin is Jesse Gemstone.
Exactly.
Really, that's gonna stay with
Very
me for
much
a long time. Yeah.
But yeah, so there is a lot of that, a lot of using the Middle Ages basically again to kind of justify the present, right, and the kind of the sort of iniquities of the present.
Yeah, it's funny how politics can sometimes resurrect these historical figures and make claims that like, well, we've always cared about this person, in which. Right. It reminds me of the continuous American discourse, from several years ago about kind of Confederate generals and all those statues about that nobody knew were even there and nobody cared about like even a little bit. And then all of a sudden when people wanted to take them down, it's like, we've always loved our statue of, Jeb Stuart, that we never knew was there in Richmond or whatever. So, but then all of a sudden it becomes incredibly politically important for certain people. And then history all of a sudden has that kind of resonance.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the same was happening in Russia, especially like, not so much in the night, like it's, so there is a kind of, scholars talk about a kind of a conservative turn that happens in the kind of early 2000s with Putin, kind of like once Putin kind of consolidated his power a little bit more by like 2004, 2005, something like that, you start to see this kind of more conservative turn of Russian politics. And it's really that turn that coincides with a lot of this focus on the Middle Ages because, again, right, he's trying to kind of resurrect a lot of those figures. And yeah, you see like not just like people rediscovering statues, but like statue building campaigns, right?
But erecting new ones. Yeah, we were saying, yeah.
My favorite example is, Alexander Nevsky, whose statues are now like all over Russia. When they took over the eastern part of Ukraine, right, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, they've installed some there. They've installed some in Crimea after taking it over. They've installed one, there's like a bust of Alexander Nevsky at a Russian airbase in Syria.
Really?
Which is like probably the southernmost Nevsky ever been, I imagine, being from like northern Rus.
Yeah.
But again, to kind of like, this is like our thing, which again, in itself is very similar to how during the Russian Empire, they would build these grand cathedrals to Saint Alexander Nevsky on the kind of periphery, right? In the kind of, or either by kind of within the Russian Empire, but on the western sort of edges, or just kind of like right outside. So there is Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Woods, I think, in Poland and in Tallinn and in Sofia in Bulgaria, right? So there is this idea of like we're kind of cementing our influence by building these like monumental cathedrals that are kind of project, right, power and Christianity very much, side by side, right? Because really, especially in the, again, 18th century, 19th century, and into the 20th. And of course, now, like, the church was always like the arm of the state
Sure.
in Russia. Sometimes literally, I mean, for most of the Russian kind of empire for the last couple of centuries, right, it was like the synod was a ministry of the state. Like, there were no patriarchs because you don't need a patriarch, you have a czar.
Always be suspicious of politicians erecting statues of historical figures.
Totally.
Always. Just because history matters. History does matter, So.
Well, and also, I mean, a statue, right? I mean, that's all I always explain to my students, that, like, you can't do nuance with statues, right?
Statues aren't meant to do nuance.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So they're really good at promoting a particular vision, but, they're not intricate enough to represent actual reality of history.
No, they're meant to literally materialize a certain interpretation of a certain event or a certain person. That's what they do. And on that note, unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we do have to cut this short. But there's so much more to discuss, so maybe we'll have you back at some point in the future. So
I'll be happy to.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for joining us. If people do want to learn more about you or your work, is there a place online that they might be able to find you?
So yeah, I'm on Blue Sky at Eugene-Smelyansky, Smelyansky at Blue Sky, and Eugene-Smelyansky.com is the website where I've kind of started to pull together like everything, including like publications and things that people can more easily find about me.
Yes, faculty websites are often notoriously difficult to manage. Something people don't know is that oftentimes individual faculty don't manage their own websites, and so you're kind of at the whim of the university. So always good to have your own personal website where you can kind of do these things. So please look Eugene up and send him any of your questions. I don't mean to flood your inbox, but hopefully people will have some questions. Thank you again for joining us. This has been a really amazing conversation. And let me thank as well our listeners, of course. Thank you again for joining us for another episode of American Medieval. Until next week, stay medieval, I guess. I don't know. I'll come up with a better tagline sometime. All right. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.